my big picture thought about this for a while, and a lot of it has been born of a late night drinking with Aaron Kaufman as well, is that we are an industry in practice because we have distinct experience that is necessary. We have specific associations and we have an economic impact. But I don't think we're one in formality and in governance because we have no like central regulation or standards.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Production Value Matters, the Business Events Podcast. This is the panel episode for the month of February. In 2025, we have been hearing some crazy news in economics and geopolitical bits and pieces. We're going to try to avoid that on today's episode, although I'm sure that will flavor our conversations. Today, we are represented, as usual, by Nick Borelli from Zenis and Evan Babbins from Scotiabank, their event planning team. Candace will not be joining us this week because she's out on an event, as we all tend to be very, very busy this time of year. And if you're listening, do us a huge favor. It really helps us out if you click that subscribe button on whatever platform you're watching or listening on right now. Leave us a review. They're really, really helpful for us to guide the content. And of course, if you're interested in learning more about the podcast or accessing related content, go to productionvaluematters.com and subscribe there. This month, we're going to be talking about a potential contentious topic. But before we get into that, I want to ask Evan and Nick, how are you guys doing?
Great. Yeah, this time of year is ramps up to a lot of industry events, of which I'm starting to attend a couple of those a month. So I enjoy the heck out of that. I love my family. I'm not saying I don't, but I get a lot of them in December, and then once it starts January, February, I'm get to see my event family a lot more as well.
That's great. That's fantastic. And Evan, how are things going on the northern side of the border?
Yeah, things are great. So this is now month almost 3 at the new job at Scotia. Things are like nonstop craziness. Like I started mid-November and I've already been on 14 different projects. We're on track to do about 150 events this year across North America. So we're actually coming down south of the border a little bit more this year than ever before. So we've got a lot of stuff happening across Canada and the US, into Latin America a little bit. So yeah, we're on track to do about 150 events across the year, which is no small feat. But the team is great and the team has been really welcoming, and it's been just like literally nonstop. I had the 1 week over the holidays in December, but other than that, it's been nonstop, go, right in the fire. So that's the way I like it. No rest for the wicked. And that's the best way to learn coming into a new job and new people and everything else. So it's been good, really good.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like put you in the busy section right away so that you learn, right?
Yeah, we don't have, it seems like we don't actually have a slow season when you're doing 150 events a year. So it's better than the alternative.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's certainly been as I said, we're not going to get into anything geopolitical, but it's been some interesting conversations going across the market. And there's a big elephant standing in the other side of the room here, but that affects that sort of cross-border traffic. But that's a subject for another podcast and perhaps another panel discussion down the road. But so what we're going to be talking about today is, as I discussed with you guys just before we started recording, we recently recorded an episode with a prevalent member of the event market, and that was Aaron Kaufman, who will be appearing on an episode very shortly on PVM. And one of the things that Aaron brought up was the idea that, and we've all had these discussions in the past because we all know Aaron. I'm sure we have all been in a conversation with him about this before. That the events industry doesn't actually exist, that it's not an industry. The way that he puts it is that it is a series of practitioners. It's a vocation rather than a profession, which I think he goes a little bit too far on. And what I said to everybody on the panel in some offline conversations is, after my call with him, I was kind of convinced. That it's true, that it's not an industry. And I have a certain opinion about that, and I'd love to discuss it. However, one of the initiatives that's happening right now is during the COVID lockdowns, when other industries were looking for relief funding or aid from various governmental levels, whether that be state, provincial, or federal, on both, and in the examples of Canada and the US. It was very difficult for people who are running businesses related to events, meetings, which, for just for reference sake, we'll call the MICE industry, which is meetings, incentives, conventions, and exhibits. And it was very difficult for them to access funding because we didn't have a NAICS code or a unifying NAICS code. There are a series of other NAICS codes that relate to the practice of events and the output of events, whether that's hospitality, travel. Audiovisual has its own NAICS code, but event planning and event management doesn't necessarily have it. And so one could argue, does it deserve a NAICS code? And is that a measure of whether or not we are, quote unquote, an industry? Or does it not? Because, and I'll express my argument why I don't necessarily think it's necessary. I mean, it would be nice, but it's not critically necessary for events as an industry to have a NAICS code because of how I now see it. But I've ranted for a couple of seconds. Nick, the expression on your face is very telling that you want to sort of jump in. So I'm going to say, what's your opinion? Is events an industry?
I have so many things that are loaded in this, and then I keep coming back to this thought is, does it matter? But like, I guess I want to put the does it matter maybe at the end, because and when I say does it matter, I mean in practical, reasons. I think you gave a really great practical example of the formality being of value in a really big way. You also mentioned COVID, which I think will become really interesting as we have this conversation later, because I feel like one of the other pitches of is it an industry is, if not, what is it? And maybe it's a subset of something else. And if it's a subset of I think that the biggest ones that have formalities around it that we get lumped into when it comes to economic impact ends up being travel and tourism. But during COVID, there was no travel or tourism element of the events industry. We weren't contributing to any travel, and yet we were doing work. We were doing work that was, other than some of the tactical elements, pretty analogous. People were coming together, ideas were being shared, brands were growing, right? So but there was no travel and there was no tourism. So is events intrinsic element of that? So a million things at once. My big picture thought about this for a while, and a lot of it has been born of a late night drinking with Aaron Kaufman as well, is that we are an industry in practice because we have distinct experience that is necessary. We have specific associations and we have an economic impact. But I don't think we're one in formality and in governance because we have no central regulation or standards. So so if you had to put me in a one or the other, which I guess is part of this, I would say we're not an industry, but colloquially within ourselves, we are, and that functionally has value.
So, Evan, what is your opinion? Do you think we are an industry or not?
So I think it's kind of a bit of chicken and egg scenario. So I actually don't agree with what Nick just said about we fall into sort of the travel and tourism bucket. I look at events as actually falling. If I would say that we are an industry, that's my top level opinion is yes, we are an industry. Secondary from that is where do we fit if the general consensus is we aren't our own self identifying industry, where do we fall in? Where Nick went travel and tourism, I would go more marketing. And so where I see events coming in is that we have proven over the last year and a half or 18 months to 2 years in a post-COVID environment that events as an execution and as a practice is the number one go-to market strategy within a marketing environment. And so when you look at it in that capacity, I think events should live under marketing because we're one piece of the marketing funnel. We are potentially the largest and the most intense piece of that funnel. But if we are not living on our own island and we have to go on someone else's island, I would suggest that we go under the marketing island versus the travel and tourism one because we fit so well into the funnel. And I would say 90% plus ish of event producers, event marketers are working within, if you're in-house, I'm saying just from an in-house capacity, you're working within, generally speaking, a larger marketing team that you fit into larger marketing campaigns, and you are one execution element of a larger integrated campaign. So in that capacity, I would argue that our island should be the marketing island, not the travel and tourism island.
By the way, I think I don't disagree with you. I think we're on a journey towards what you're saying. And I think we may be there or we may almost be there. But if you follow the money of the associations, like if you look at the members of Events Industry Council and you look at who pays all of the bills for all of those associations, it's all travel and tourism. On the other hand, it's become like more of a data-driven experience in the last like 15 or so years that is a channel that is proper as opposed to some sort of like economic. So it depends on if you look at it like in the practice of it, I think content marketing, I see that for sure. If you look at it in the who are the leaders that are guiding the where it is going from a governance standpoint or from a standard standpoint, it's all travel and tourism.
The argument is that the people who control, I'll say in air quotes, the industry revolves around associations, where I don't know if that's 100% the case, because I'm not associated with any associations myself. I don't consider myself any less involved in the industry or less of an ability to control my piece of the pie of the industry. So then I guess is the question that we're asking, are the associations the ones who drive governance and standards and things like that? Or is it the industry as a whole?
So before we get into that next subject, because I think that's where the conversation will go, I'm just going to say my opinion is that we are not an industry, but we are several industries that serve the MICE market, right? That we all, whether or not you like, and to Nick's point, and to I think the point you were about to get to, Evan. So sorry to cut you off, but I really wanted to put this point in that yes, what the next question we're going to ask each other here is what would make us an industry, and I'll give the idea of like hospitality, which is an industry that involves people who run hotels, cruise ships, restaurants, venues, like whatever, like that's an industry, but they serve multiple markets. So a hotel can be in the hospitality industry and serve business events and conferences and incentives and exhibits, but also leisure travel, all of those kind of things. So then the same way that I look at audiovisual is an industry that serves multiple markets. The same widgets that are created and used as products and services can be used in the mice market, but also the film and television industry or market, or the concert touring or wedding or whatever it might be. So there's where that's the big mind shift that I've had over the last couple of months, is to say, oh, we're not part of I am part of an industry. My industry is audiovisual production and services, but we happen to serve the mice market. And so then to say, in contrast to that, if we look at peripheral things close to what we do, you work for a bank. And so is that the financial services industry? Is something like retail? Is retail an industry, or is it a methodology? Is that a methodology in which we sell products and services? We certainly have, as a bank, you have retail banking, you have investor banking, you have high net worth bank, all of these kind of things, and institutional and B2B and all this kind of stuff. But essentially, you're a financial services industry. You're not a retail banking industry. And so for us to say that we are all in this conglomerate industry that is actually a market or a methodology of selling our product and services out of an industry. That's my take on it. And so then the question becomes, so what makes something an industry? Is it, to Nick's point about governance, about standards, when you say that you're not a member of an association, doesn't that pertain to say that in most industries, you have to be a member of a trade association to be considered a member of that industry? And the financial services industry has various things that dictate certain legs of it, accounting being one of them. Here in Canada, you cannot be a professional accountant if you don't have your certified professional accountants run by CPA Canada and or Ontario or whatever province. But as a practitioner in the events market, you don't have to have a certification to be able to, like a base certification to be able to practice in this. But you can work for an industry like audiovisual or marketing consulting or, like professional services industry, whatever it might be. And you could do events as an output into a particular market. But I think that's one of the barriers, is that governance and standards, which then leads to the next question. And I'm going to throw it back out to the both of you. Who is responsible for those standards and membership? And is it the associations? Are they doing a good job? Should we be finding something new?
So just before we get into those questions, I want to just go back on something you said before, Matt, which was, so you said as you're part of the audiovisual services industry that services the mice environment or the mice market. So then let me ask you a question. So let's say I was getting married and I had a venue, I had catering, I had everything. I have a band and the band needs AV equipment and they need AV support and AV production. I come to you and I say, hey, Matt, you own an AV production company. You can provide me with speakers and lights and staging and video and everything else that I need for my wedding to go off properly. And I can't have a wedding without those elements. If you say yes to that job, are you now not servicing the market that your business is serving? Because you said that you serve the mice industry. Weddings don't fit into the mice industry. That would be if they're a destination wedding, it would count.
Well, no. So it's meetings, incentives, conventions, and events is like, so it would fall under as that market. And, for me specifically, the inventory that I have, the products that I sell, the services that I sell are not targeted towards weddings. So in reality, if you came to me and said, hey, Matthew, I got a wedding and I really want you to do it, I'd be like, I'd love to. I love you, Evan. I wish you mazel tov, a wonderful life together. but I don't really do that. But if you were to say, hey, I run this big tech company and I want, like, that's kind of what we do. We've specifically targeted our services and our offering to the market in a very specific niche or pie slice of that market. But it doesn't mean that as an event, like somebody who is a professional who works in the event market, that I can do everything of those, convention. Yeah, I can do meetings, I can do incentives, and I can do conventions. I don't really do some of these social events in the big E. And so that's where I say, like, if you are, in contrast to being an industry in audiovisual services, right? I could make a choice that says, I service the film and television market. I service the MICE market, but not weddings. I love wedding planners. They are a special beast and wonderful people. But what I do is different than, let's say, a wedding planner, like a Lynn Fletcher out of Calgary. Her consulting firm, because essentially it's a consulting firm. It's her and a bunch of creative directors, and they're very good at what they do. And it's a very highly specialized skill set. And it serves a specific market, not an industry. It like the industry that she participates in is the management and consulting and design firms, not the you can have two different companies, Lynn Fletcher Weddings and XYZ event agency. They're both marketing or management and consultant firms, but one serves weddings and one serves, sales kickoffs.
For the record, my wife and I got married in 2015, so like I'm not looking for a wedding.
Oh, okay. You're not looking for wedding gifts, right? Because I don't have anything to give
production services. Just want to make sure that caveat is there.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
Good. Yeah, weddings are one that throws me for a loop. So weddings are there's no element of marketing that is what the intended outcome of an event is. It has no marketing prowess whatsoever, nor does. And then you can go further. So like I've had this a conversation. Are weddings part of the events industry? As far as the EIC is concerned and their membership, no. None of the organizations there are concerned with them, which again, to me, is because their purse string holders are in travel and tourism, and they just don't see it as that significant. It's more of an element of tourism at best for destinations, but they don't. Destination weddings, a minor, insignificant statistically element of tourism. So is that, and then you get even further out, sports, theater, those are live events. You don't see them in IMAX, right? So like, as far as the practicalities of it, these are all super arbitrary. And the fact that they're arbitrary and that there are suppliers that do work on weddings, and I know lighting companies that work on corporate events, theater, sports, it's fine. Because audiovisual to me is a defined thing, and those other things are markets. Those are choices. Like Matthew, you choose not to work in events. I've worked for audiovisual companies who do weddings, conferences, trade. They're just a market. Like they're like, we have people that can execute them. And then I've worked at ones that have decided to not do some of those that they used to do because they're like the profit margins. Those are all market decisions. They're not categorical decisions. The category, but they can't just decide not to be audiovisual.
But that's my point, though, right? Is that's the difference. So, like, getting back to the question of, so if what is it that is characteristic of an industry, and I want to sort of jump on the governance and regulation, because depending on your outlook on as a listener, whether or not you believe in regulation, like from, both extremes all the way to the middle, we certainly work in several industries that have certain levels of regulation and certification and bring those to the market, but that the market as a whole doesn't have a lot of, and EIC being a perfect example. They're EIC will push a couple of certifications for individuals, like
that you could choose to have or not have. Like,
exactly.
So to me, it's like, let's talk about EIC just for 2 seconds. If, in case people don't know, like Event Industry Council is, the members of that are all going to be all the associations that are the major associations from PCMA to MPI to sites, IACA. Yeah, ILEA probably, maybe. So all of those ones, right? And like, so as you could be a member of those, they are a member of that. So it's a body above that. And we, if we want to be on the record as far as talking about their effectiveness, we could, but like, let's just talk about what they're supposed to do. And then if there's anyone else that would be doing it instead of them or above them, is that what we got? Is my question.
I think that is what we have, right? And so, as for regulation and a body that does that, yes, in theory, EIC is supposed to hold accountable MPI, PCMA, SEMA, like all the ILEA, all of those groups. They're supposed to hold them accountable and push down a regulatory standard to them. And those organizations are supposed to be accountable to EIC. However, as Nick's face is pertaining, and I have participated in leadership, as have you, Nick, for many years.
I've been on task force and with EIC and also within a number of those industries and continue to do, or associations rather, and continue to do that. It seems very voluntary at every level.
You're right. What we are missing in that, and I think that the challenge in how we're missing that boat comes in the fact that we're trying to apply a industry standard to a market versus what, say, AVIXA, which is in the audiovisual industry. I can't remember what exactly it stands for, but it's essentially the Association of Practitioners of Audiovisual Services, and they, like, for instance, they have a certification course. It's called the Certified Technical Specialist, and it has different variations. So if you're going into integration, there's a -I, which is a separate market, a separate product base, separate service model, the whole deal, versus design, which is systems design, versus general specialist, which is usually used for the audiovisual production industry. But again, even in that industry, the regulatory certification is a nice to have, not a mandatory to have.
So that's where I was going with this, is like, we have EIC, we have all these associations, and like, I think one question is like, what they should be doing is maybe not what they actually are doing versus what we think they need to be doing. So that's one kind of consideration. The second consideration is, great, we have all these associations and we have this EIC governing body, but if I'm not a member of any of those bodies and any of those associations and a member of EIC, does that make me less of an event professional than anybody else? Am I doing a less job than anyone else? And at the end of the day, does it matter? Like, does it like I can do the same job that I'm doing as an EIC member, as a member of PCMA, as a member of ILEA, or without any of those things? And I think this is, like, from conversations I've had with Aaron and other people, the answer that I think a lot of us get to is that, like, because there's nothing that's mandated, because the associations and the bodies don't actually do things that they say they want to do, it has led to an industry or a group of people who do what they are going to do regardless of if they're a member or not, because there's never been anything that has said you must follow these sets of rules. You must be a paying member of this association, like accounting has, and that, financial services has. And like, I know a lot of people who, you can't practice what you do in a certain industry if you don't have a license, or if you don't have, you pay your dues and whatever. So like, right. So that's the question here, is like, is like, if they're not mandating anything and we're still doing our jobs without them mandating anything, why would we all of a sudden make ourselves be part of a mandate if for the last 20, 30 plus years we've never had that? It's going to take a lot of work to get the entire industry or the entire practitioner group of the events world on board with that shift, if that in fact is a shift that has to happen or needs to happen.
I don't think it will, because it doesn't have the gravity.
Well, I think it's reminiscent, Evan, of what happened with the CPA certification. This is 75, 60 years ago, right? Where a bunch of people who were very good at math and read a bunch of, like, did what most, I think, professionals in our market do, which is like, no, I'm a smart person. I can understand the process of building an event from scratch and being strategic, and I'm a smart person. And like yourself, look, you're amazing at your job. You don't need a certification to tell you to not to do it right. However, what happened with accountants was that it went off the rails, that because you didn't need a certification, you didn't need a license, you didn't need regulatory body, anybody could put up a shingle and say, I'm your accountant. And because a lot of people in, I can speak for Canada, but, at the end of the 19th century, a lot of people lost money to people who were like, don't worry, I'm a financial advisor. And they lost money, and the government stepped in and said, wait a minute. Okay, you can't just do that. You actually have to be certified in this. Like, you have to have this licensing. You have to have this standard of practice, all of these things. And things like the CPA were created. Now, I will argue that if an event goes poorly, and over the last 2 years, I can tell you there have been, across North America, plenty of events that have caused bodily injury, financial ruin, and death and dismemberment. And I'll give an example of when the Raptors won the NBA championship a couple of years ago. The city decided that they were going to have a parade from the national exhibition. And did you almost get crushed by the crowd? I'm going to get to that in a second.
MPI had their conference at the same time, and we all just kind of like went out, and it was bonkers.
It was, because and I was watching it on TV, and as a practitioner of live events who's been in this business for 25 years, I turned on the TV and went, this, like 1 second it took me to look at that and go, this is going to be disastrous. Somebody's going to get hurt. And because there was a shooting, there was dehydration, there was there were crowd dynamics at play, safety issues. They had to shut down, shorten the program at City Hall because they were afraid that there was going to be a stampede. And I can tell you, I turned to my family and we were watching. I said, they went with the lowest bidder, who said, oh, sure, I can do that. I can figure it out.
And there's no delineations. Like, the person who got that bid was in the events industry and is legally allowed to do what they do. And somebody who is great and wouldn't have done that is legally allowed to do what they do, because they don't see, because there hasn't been enough gravity, I think, to warrant what is industry standards. And I think that, like, what is an industry? I think an industry is one that has rock hard standards, and we don't have that. I know people, I mean, how many people do you know who put on some really great music for bar and bat mitzvahs 15 years ago and are now audiovisual production people who put stages together and hang things? I know a dozen. And like, their foundation could make 13-year-olds have a good time. Like, that's their entry point. And some of them have taken it upon themselves to be excellent at production. And some of them didn't need to because their market didn't require. So it's the Wild West. And when it's the Wild West, to me, and like the biggest body that organizes the other bodies, puts together recommendations, and that's the teeth that they have. To me, that doesn't meet the standard of what an industry is, against other industries who could say, if you don't do these things, you're out. And if you don't do these things, you're not even allowed in.
But then, like, what happens? Like, so for example, like Matt is a great example of the Raptors parade. But then you look at like that. I think it was, which concert was in Vegas with the shooting that was like Vegas Strong? Was it Ariana Grande or?
It was
Vegas Music Week or something.
I was there 5 days later after that one too. That was in Mandalay.
So right,
yeah,
so remember like that concert. So then you look at that. So you look at that scenario, right? And you're like, was that the event organizer's responsibility to keep things safe? Is it the police to keep things safe and not allow guns in the concerts? Like, where does the, like, at what point in the process, when you have events to that scale and to that size, is it off the responsibility of the event producer or the management company of that event, and it's onto local authorities and police, and when it gets crazy, like army and whatever?
I can give you a perfect example of that. Like, let's go back to CPAs, right? Is geopolitical economic trends, the Bank of the US Fed or the Bank of Canada setting an interest rate and tax policy, those are outside the control of the individual accountant, but the certification that they have is to stay abreast of those international and national, federal, provincial, state standards. And so I do think that if we were to have any kind of regulatory body that certifies our ability to put up a shingle, that, yeah, remember that the Raptors thing was a planning and production error that caused problems versus an external threat, which was, and are you talking about the Mandalay Bay shooting, the one from the hotel? So that was an unforeseen, like if you did a risk management grid, which as a professional, we do a risk management grid, right? That's like a standard of practice. I can guarantee you the guy who did the Raptor show did not have a risk management grid. He did not sort of do the red and green and yellow and went, that's a high risk. I should probably do something about it. And the Mandalay Bay shooting, to be honest, was such on a high, low likelihood, high consequence that they went, yeah, I mean, it's possible that could happen. And we'll take some general steps that are reasonable under a risk assessment and they had law enforcement on site and they had proper barrier control and they stuck to crowd size metrics that were dictated from experience and professionalism, but nobody holds them to that standard.
The industry didn't hold them accountable afterwards, to say you did everything you were supposed to based on our standards, or you failed those standards.
What does our standards mean? Like, where, like, who decides when you say, like, when you're like looking at an event, like you look at an event like IMAX, for example, right? Or like any like CES, like any of these big events in, conference and trade show. Like when you look at their, when you get your registration and your ticket, you go through like your code of conduct and like whatever. So you agree to that. You click off everyone. No one actually reads that. You just check the box to get a ticket. So then when something happens and then we look back at it after and we're like, the standards of play weren't acceptable and the event didn't do its due diligence to make sure that everything was covered. We don't have a book that says these are the rules that you have to stick to, because if we did, I mean,
the EIC would say there is a book, but there's no teeth. There are
no one that enforces the book, right?
Because there's no enforcement.
Right, because you look at like a concert, like you look at concerts that happen, in dungy venues and whatever, and you get these like rock punk, mosh pit concerts that people are getting black and blue and literal broken bones coming out of, but they're having a great time. So you look at the audience, and the audience is like, no, that was the best concert of my life. And I was in the mosh pit for 3.5 hours. But then afterwards, that person who was out for, a concert on a Saturday night, they have to go to their office at whatever they do on Monday morning. They join a meeting and their face is black and blue. Like, is there something or someone that's responsible for that?
But that's the point. That's not the standard, right? The standard, like, because look, human beings, like, they smoke, they eat red meat, they drink alcohol on the weekends. Audience feedback should not be. And so what's happening now without these regulations and without a governing body is that the opinion of the market is dictating it. So to your point, as you were telling the story about a mosh pit and people getting bloodied and blue, like, yeah, those guys walked out of there going like, what an amazing experience, man. I love that band. And that's the same sentiment that we as event professionals are trying to get out of the engagement of our sales teams at the SKO. It's like, it was so engaging and inspiring, but there was no standard around that. So there's no way to replicate it. And so you're just sort of like, well, they liked it, so let's just keep doing it. And the only thing stopping people and from poor is the market dictating that.
So that's why it's a market, is because there's market influence is the only influence. And like the Mandalay Bay shooting is a good example of that. Months after that, there was a proliferation of sessions and presentations, because again, I'm at all these things within the events industry talking about what you should do for active shooters. So there was a market response, but there wasn't an industry response. So they were trying to say, hey, it would be cool if you guys like boned up on this so like less people are shot. That's how little teeth there is in that, because there's no barriers, there's no way into the club, and there's no way to be kicked out of the club. You could do that. You could be the person who made the mistake then and continue to do events afterwards. And the only thing that would keep you from making those events is the market saying, you killed too many people.
We don't like that, so don't do that.
And now, like, another layer to add to this sort of puzzle that we're building here is, okay, Mandalay Bay happened in Vegas, which is, like, a lot of people consider to be Vegas like the epicenter of events in the entire world, which I don't necessarily agree with, but that's a side point. But so that happened in Vegas, right? The Raptors thing happened in Toronto. What happens, and what do we do now about, okay, I'm an event professional who lives in Tokyo, Japan, or Auckland, New Zealand, which is nowhere near geographically where those things happened. And I only hear about those things via maybe word of mouth, or there was a post on LinkedIn about it, or a blog post written about it. And as an industry person in Tokyo, Japan, I have zero connection to what happened in Vegas. So now is the standards that we're setting for Vegas the same standards that we're setting for Tokyo and Moscow and Brazil? And is it global, or is it national? What is it?
I think you're hitting on one of the reasons that as we just said, Nick, you and I, that the market dictated a response, but the associations were silent. And because the associations and I can speak from my experience being in leadership and speaking to executive directors and the boards and going, why don't we do this? And the response is, well, we're afraid to tell people something in lieu of saying the wrong thing. So to your point, Evan, and how it was personified when I was in international leadership was, well, we don't want to tell them what to do because we could get sued for telling them what to do in case it's the wrong answer.
That's so important, what you just said. It's because they have no teeth. So for instance, because it's all volunteer, because there's no barriers, because it's a market making market decisions, the things that that dictate the rules of the market are the money. This is why I started initially back with do you want to know what we are? We're a function of whoever has the purse strings of the EIC, which is 100% tourism and hospitality. So the fear of the association, whichever the one that you may be speaking of, that while you were in a leadership position had, is because they could be made irrelevant and go away because they could make mad the people who have the real control, which are the people who pay for these associations. And if it was a real industry, it would say, this is it. If you don't do this, you're out, because we exist for the betterment of it purely, not for the betterment of it So we continue to exist because some of those associations disappear, and they don't disappear because they're making bold decisions. They disappear because they're not sponsored anymore.
So the specific example I was giving was they were worried about not necessarily like taking off the tourism industry, which was their financial backer, but literally that they would say standard of practice in this market should be X, and that people would members would follow that directive, and that they were worried about the legal liability of that member going off and doing that, getting sued, or making a mistake and then saying, well, my association told me to do it. And they were like, whoa, we don't advise, right? And I was like, but that's the whole point of you being here, is to advise and to support and to reinforce those standards. I think I hit a hot button subject that I'm sure we could talk about for another hour and a half. But this may dictate a part 2 at some point. But we do have to wrap up today because we're running out of time.
I'm hoping people have these conversations themselves after hearing this. Like if you've never heard of this conversation because you're just doing the work, which I think is fair. This might, I hope for someone listening to this, might just get them to have conversations with people they know and say, is it, and then it could go on forever for anyone, I think, which is exciting, I think.
So do you think that, okay, we always like to talk about an actionable step after episodes of the podcast. What do you think? So you're in the mind of a listener who's sitting there's going to be I'm going to bucket a few reactions here, that it's either like, what are you talking about? This is fine. I'm doing fine. There's one that's sort of, let's call them bi-curious on this, that they're like, well, I mean, good points, but whatever it is. But then there's somebody who's listening in the audience going, Jesus, you're right. I need to take action. What do you think we could do? Save which the response I sometimes get in this conversation is, well, we should start our own association, which is too hard and I don't want to do it. Right. What do you think people should be demanding? And I'll go back to the CPA thing, that in the late 19th century, there was a bunch of really good CPAs or accountants and bookkeepers and et cetera, who said, you know what, you're right. This is criminal if we are dealing with people's lives and their livelihoods, that we should be held to a better standard. So what they did is they all sort of jumped in and said, and lobbied and did these things. So should we be going to EIC and our associations and from a groundswell saying, hey, we want these standards, we want this type of barriers to entry and regulation? Is that what we think? What do we think listeners should be doing after listening to this episode?
I think the first question you have to ask yourself, when you think about those questions, is what's the energy versus outcome factor? If it's going to take 10 years to create some kind of a standard that's then implemented, that everybody has to pay into and be part of to be in our industry, like CPA, is that worth risking all the events that we're all doing where we don't have that? So I think it's either there has to be a overnight cold turkey, if you're not a member of EIC, you will not be able to put on an event that will get insurance and liability and everything else, and you're in or you're not. And then if you're not, and we catch you doing an event, there's, legal and government, whatever can come back and deal with you. Or the flip side is, if we just keep doing what we're doing, do we just have conversations on a local level where it's as a Toronto market that Matthew and I both subscribe to, right? In Toronto, in our market, do we all, as Toronto planners, professionals, producers, do we all agree to do things this way? In Calgary, they do it different. In Vancouver, they do it different. And New York and Boston and Chicago and wherever else, every local, area or region has a way they do things. And it's we just subscribe to that playbook. So I think it's one of the two. It's you can't have both. You can't not have events until something is figured out, because events won't stop happening because you can't like physically stop them from happening. But then there's, like we talked about earlier, is like, what's the point? Like, we're all doing good now. So like, is it worth the energy that it's going to take to get there? If we're already subscribed to not doing that, why would all of a sudden we do it?
So my response to that is, I think it's the responsibility of the association, and we as professionals should be holding our associations accountable for very simple changes that they could do that would change that standard conversation. Because you're right, everybody in this industry or in this market or as a practitioner is like, well, I can do this without that. So why would I put in the effort? So I think that they should take their certifications and either amalgamate them or change the differentiation on it, so that it's not about, hey, Evan, you've been a professional for 20 years, I'm guessing, and have gained all this experience. Now you are eligible, or you're the person we want to have this CMP, CSEP, blah, 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 blah. I think it should be changed in the emphasis to go, you just graduated school, you should get this, so that you at least have a baseline to begin with. The second thing I'm going to say is that I think it's the responsibility of the associations to go to, say, insurance providers and sell them on the idea that we don't want you to change your rates. We just want you to give a discount to anybody who has this base certification that denotes not only do they know what a difference between a lectern and a podium, but they carry insurance, they have a legally binding contract, they have liability, understanding of liability, they have met these standards, so that as a business owner, as a private practitioner, as a solopreneur, however you want to put it, or as a professional who works for Scotiabank, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, that the insurance rates that your employer or your business or yourself as an individual pay are rewarded because of this situation. And then the final thing is that we as a groundswell have to tell our associations, you need to go and communicate that value to the market on our behalf. No more of this like, hey, let's get together and share what the coolest color is this year. That does not matter whatsoever to an economic association. What they should be doing is going out to every single brand, agency, marketing, all of our markets that we all work in, and on our behalf saying there is a difference between the guy who did the Raptors parade and the professionals that do the Run for the Cure on the same piece of land, but at a different standard. Right. And two, you're like, is it different between Toronto, Calgary, Sydney, Japan? Human movement dynamics, how people react. There are some cultural nuances in there, but generally, no, it's all the same. It's just, it's like standards are standards, right?
Yeah. Like, a standard for a tent and a standard for a stage and a standard for cooking food. So like they should be really concerned with standards and not the trappings, like the colors, like, as you mentioned. But EIC purports to be a global organization with 100,000 individuals, 19,000 entities, etc. So like for me, it's like, what do you do next? If you have the inclination that you want to make a better market, I would say do what Evan said and get everybody in your city together and talk about pass-fail standards and ways of doing things, etc. If you've got a lot of energy and you want to say, geez, I think that this is a macro thing that I have ability to make an impact on, rise up through the ranks of an association up until the point where you get to potentially a level at the EIC. Or if you really have unlimited energy and good luck to you, I guess you could create a rival, association of associations. And go in through the process of that. The trick of it is, to me, is the spectrum of travel, tourism, hospitality to marketing, because you're doing things that are related to all of those different areas, and because they have very different concerns associated with what you do. I find it to be really challenging to determine if you are a member of the events industry and you are a audiovisual provider that works on broadcasting in the events industry and weddings, how that any of that works. You know, if they're all different markets and they're contributing their thing, I think that's pretty simple and straightforward and like ultimately what we've decided on. But if you want to make it bigger, then the difference between all of those other mature industries and where we're at is barriers. And like, there isn't any. I mean, I can talk to thousands of people within a given year who contribute to live events industry and tell them what they should be doing, and no one governs me. So like, I'm making it up, you know, and I'm doing it in the most responsible way I can. But the EIC's never said, Nick, hey, we don't really think that what you're telling them is responsible. They've never had a conversation with me or looked at anything that I've given to tons of people over years and years. So you'd have to start somewhere. I don't know. I find that like it's a big question, but like ultimately, as long as we're all doing better, I think that like that's what we can control.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've run out of time. So I want to say thank you to Evan and to Nick for joining me on the panel. And as usual, if you can want to subscribe to the podcast and some of the additional content, go to productionvaluematters.com and subscribe there. Evan, Nick, thank you for joining me this month, and we'll see you in March.
See you then.
See ya. Okay. Production Value Matters, the business events podcast, is brought to you by Byrne Production Services. To learn more about Byrne Production Services and how we can achieve your business goals, head over to byrneproductionservices.com. Thanks for listening.